Well, last time we concluded, I concluded, I should say, talking about the Missouri Compromise, and really it's those who are paying attention to it recognized that this was a very serious problem. They have, these various issues raised by the crisis, or by the admission of Missouri into the Union. Whether the federal government can control a state, that's one issue. Whether the institution of slavery would spread, and also this other question, which some were now asking. And by the way, I'm going to talk next week about writing, and I don't like people to use phrases like "some people say" or "some historians say." So when I do that, jump up and say, "Stop doing that." I will be more specific. Some members of Congress and others whose livelihood depended on the institution of slavery, who were entangled in the institution of slavery, began seeing slavery as an essential thing, particularly as cotton becomes the chief American export, and also as the New England states begin developing the textile industry, which also depends on cotton. So you have the development in the United States of a different economic system or different economic power, which relies on the institution of slavery or rests on the institution of slavery. And so the long-term consequences of that are quite alarming, particularly as some of the founders, Jefferson, Madison, had believed that slavery was a limited institution that would be put on the road to extinction. But now we see the institution of slavery spreading into Alabama, Mississippi, places that are very good for the growing of cotton, production of cotton, and so the institution is becoming more entrenched. So that's one issue we see here, and we'll be talking more about the institution of slavery in the coming weeks. Then the other part of this equation is, as a defense of this institution of slavery, we see some members of Congress looking to the Union as an impediment to this, or fearing what will happen as a consequence. You may remember James Madison back in 1787 and 88 had speculated that at some point the Union might break apart over the issue of slavery if it becomes a regional institution. And during the Missouri debate, he has that line about, these masses clashing against one another if slavery becomes a sectional issue. Now, Thomas Cobb, who was a senator from Georgia, wrote in the wake of the Missouri controversy that we have kindled a fire which seas of blood can only extinguish, looking ahead to a civil war. And one thing that happens as a consequence, an indirect perhaps consequence of this, is that white Southerners, dependent on the institution, back in 1787, very rare to find a slave owner who would advance the idea that slavery was a good thing. Also, boy, we really wish we didn't have this institution, bad thing. The Declaration of Independence, the draft that was excised, blames the British for it. But that changes in the 1820s and 1830s. You find more people advancing the idea that slavery actually is a good thing. Eugene Genovese, the historian who's written probably more about the mindset of the planters than anyone else, is that it was enough for one generation, the generation of Jefferson and Madison, to denounce the institution of slavery while enjoying the way of life it made possible. But this next generation had to choose sides. And you see, by the 1830s, definitely, slave owners choosing sides. They have the choice of either we can denounce slavery and continue holding slaves, or we have to choose one or the other. Are we against slavery or are we for slavery? To an alarming degree, they decide they actually are for slavery, and then develop arguments about why. And slavery actually, it turns out, they will say, is a good thing. So that's part of the story here. You still find folks in the middle, like Henry Clay, slave owner from Virginia, who's really the architect of that elaborate compromise by which Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state. Maine is admitted to the Union as a free state. The southern border of Missouri, the 3630 line, is extended through the rest of the American territories, slavery prohibited north of it. And Clay was really alarmed that the words Civil War and disunion are uttered almost without emotion. And there's this sense, okay, we don't want a civil war, we don't want disunion, so what do we have to do? And what do we have to do if you don't want a civil war or disunion? Excuse me? Find some middle ground. Okay, good. Where? You know, this is 1820, and we don't know. You know, it's going to be 30 some odd years. Guy running for the Senate in Illinois will point out what to us should be obvious, that a house divided against itself can't stand. It will either be all one thing or all another. So that's what you see happening here. And I think Clay and others have a sense of this. So they see, okay, they still acknowledge that slavery is a bad thing. Therefore, if you want to save the Union, you have to do something to eliminate slavery. And the solution that comes to mind in this period is, well, perhaps a bizarre one, colonization. And Clay is one of the, he's actually president for a while of the American Colonization Society. And its real strength, this is the leading anti-slavery organization before 1831, when the anti-slavery movement takes a different tack and becomes the abolition movement. So one thing you want to avoid when you're writing about these folks is not call them abolitionists, because that has a different meaning. The colonizationists call for a gradual ending of slavery, passing gradual emancipation laws and coupling with the gradual emancipation laws a deportation of the freed people to someplace else. One likely place, actually in 1819, is the nation of Liberia, which is founded by the American Colonization Society. What's the capital of Liberia? Monrovia. Right, it's named for James Monroe, who's the President of the United States and also later becomes President of the American Colonization Society. So this is a movement, really, of slave owners from places like Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, as a way, whose slave population is actually aging, to free their slaves and send them somewhere else. This expedition of freed blacks goes to Liberia in 1819, and, well, Liberia then has its own history. And you can see, if you really are interested in what these guys are thinking, remember, to me this is one of the fascinating things. The leading colonizationists were people, well, first, another thing to bear in mind, there also was at the same time a black emigration movement. Paul Cuffey, who was a sea captain from New England, African-American, Native American, whaling captain, also wants to start a colony of freed people of color in West Africa, which was close actually to the whaling route. So that made a great deal of sense. So you have this one movement among black people saying, let's move somewhere else, and this seems like a likely place. This other movement among slave owners to send their freed people somewhere else. In the premises, slavery is wrong. Set premise number 2, black people and white people could not live together in harmony because, for a number of reasons. One being, white people would never accept blacks as their equals. And blacks would remember all the bad things white people had done to them. So if you tried simply to end slavery, there would be a race war. You know, Jefferson wrote, "We have the wolf by the ears and can neither hold him nor let him go." Justice is in one scale, self-preservation in the other. And he asked rhetorically, are our slaves to be presented with freedom and a dagger? So you have this fear of what the consequences will be if we eliminate slavery. And, you know, to our more sophisticated minds, this may all seem like nonsense, what a bunch of racists. On the other hand, I don't think the subsequent generations did as much perhaps as they could have to prove these guys wrong. So it's really a troubling issue, and this particular generation, the generation that had fought the war for independence, created the Constitution, could not resolve it. But we shouldn't necessarily blame them for that, since I don't think this generation could solve it either. So it's one of these real problems we have, and the problem is brought to the surface by the whole debate over Missouri. Okay. Any questions, thoughts on this? Yes?
Was Lincoln a member of the Colonization Society?
Was Lincoln a member of the Colonization Society? Yes, he was. In fact, during the Civil War, when emancipation is first proposed, it's coupled with colonization. And actually, there's an island off the coast of Haiti. There's always this idea we can find some other place to send these people of color.
Did he allocate funds for the island?
Yeah. And what happened? Yeah, he did. The Ile of Vache off the coast of Haiti. And there are other ideas. Madison thinks maybe the West. There's actually this great equation. I think it might be Madison has it that we have all this Western territory. We can sell the Western territory, and that will pay for colonization. And that way we will atone for the sins we've committed against one people, the Indians actually, by freeing these other people and sending them somewhere else. It's really this strange thinking, but then again, think about the nature of this particular dilemma. There was another point I wanted to make about this that your question raised in my mind. Any other questions on this? What happens to colonization is this. In 1831, there's a slave rebellion in Virginia, the Nat Turner insurrection, and the Virginia legislature, in the wake of this, begins considering colonization and emancipation. In fact, bringing back this emancipation proposal. Yes?
They're talking about all this colonization through some other place, but why not just back where we left from?
Excuse me? Well, why not back where they came from? Because actually you're now talking about people who are from here, who have been in this country since the 1600s. There was an influx of, an African population in the middle of the 1700s, but and remember, the United States ends the slave trade in 1808, and it hadn't been that big of a trade. It ended at around the time of the American Revolution, and then was reopened in around 1800, really into Georgia and South Carolina. So probably 80% of the black population in the United States is at least second generation at this time. So this is where they're from. So you can't say, we're going to repatriate them to somewhere else, because they're not from there. And the purchase of Liberia, there already are people living in Liberia, and one of the big stories in the history of Liberia, if you're at all familiar with it, over the past, since 1820, has been this conflict between the Amero-Liberians and the Liberians, that is the people who are already there. For about 150 years, these folks from the United States ran Liberia until there was a civil war about 15 years ago with, civil wars generally have horrific consequences. So, we'll get to one in a couple of weeks. So, you have this tension there, and also another problem. Back in the 1780s, the British had proposed a similar thing, starting a colony in Sierra Leone. And there, the problem was this. Okay, we're going to start a colony for freed black people in Sierra Leone. And one of the impeti for having a colony of freed black people, why are the British suddenly interested in a colony for free people of color? Well, it's because after the American Revolution, a lot of loyalists went to England, bringing their slaves with them. And so you have a black population in England for the first time, and the English get worried about this. Plus, there's an important court case in 1772 in England that says a slave brought to England cannot be returned to slavery against his will, because Parliament has never created the institution of slavery. Slavery, the British High Court says, is an institution that violates natural law. Thus, it can only exist where there has been some positive law creating it. So, this fellow, James Somerset, was a slave in Massachusetts. And in the 1640s, the Massachusetts legislature had created the institution of slavery. It had established a slave code. His owner took him to England and then was going to send him as a slave to Barbados. The Barbadian Assembly had also created the institution of slavery. So, if James Somerset was in Barbados, he could be held as a slave. If he was in Massachusetts, he could be held as a slave. But the British Parliament had never established the institution of slavery. Therefore, when James Somerset is in England, he can't be held as a slave. He cannot be sent somewhere else as a slave without his consent. Perhaps the Lord Chief Justice wanted Parliament to establish the institution of slavery, but it didn't. So this means slave owners from Barbados or the West Indies who bring their slaves to England, just because that's what they do, can't force them back. It becomes an issue. The English philanthropists proposed the colonization of Sierra Leone, and there the dilemma is, okay, you're freeing people, sending them to the west coast of Africa, and you still have slave traders who might kidnap them and sell them. That's really a strange and bizarre thing. Well, the institution of slavery introduces all kinds of strange and bizarre things. Maybe the really strange and bizarre thing happening here is a systematic, sustained campaign against the institution of slavery, where you do have folks like Jefferson, Madison, Henry Clay, John Marshall, who were all the leaders of the colonization movement, on the one hand, living this life sustained by slavery, and on the other hand saying, this is really wrong. It's a question, I suppose, for greater minds than mine to grapple with. Any other thoughts on this, questions on this? I always wonder what it is we're doing that our grandchildren will say, boy, I can't believe you folks were that vicious. Even you, Mike. Okay, so that's one of the really interesting things here. You have this society where slavery is such an important thing, but you also have this campaign against it, which isn't to say all these guys were okay because they knew what they were doing was wrong. Okay, speaking of things that are less wrong, we'll turn our attention to a happier thought. I realize how gloomy history really is as I teach it, and I don't know. I still get up in the morning happy because I get to study this. I don't know why this is. Anyway, subject for another day, I suppose. Okay. Another thing the Missouri crisis introduces or makes us think about is the possibility that this country is simply too big and will fall apart. There seem to be these two, we have a growing population is one thing. In 1800, there were a little over 5 million people in the United States, and most of them lived along the eastern seaboard, that is, east of the Appalachian Mountains. Those of us who live east of the Appalachian Mountains are dimly aware that there might be something else on the other side, and we would be in for a rude awakening if we ever did go to the top and look and see what is on the other side. Because by 1840, there were about 17 million people in the United States. So in 40 years, the population nearly quadruples, and about a third of them are west of the Appalachians. In fact, by 1815, the population was twice what it had been 25 years earlier. So we have a doubling of the population every 20 years or so, which is really a phenomenon. James Fenimore Cooper, in fact, every decade it grows by a third. Tremendous population growth. James Fenimore Cooper, the novelist, predicted that by 1850 the American population would be 24 million. And by 1880 it would be 50 million. And by 1920 he said it would be 100 million. The first impression that strikes the mind, Cooper said, is the impossibility that 100 million people should consent to live quietly under the same government. It does seem like an impossibility. So you have this question, how would you bind these people together, and how would you keep them in one country? And the institution of slavery is going to be one challenge to that, keeping them in one country. But the sheer size of the country is going to be another impediment to keeping people together. Do you want to call it and see?
Oh, it's not on.
Okay. Okay. Well, one thing that happens, speaking of losing cell phones, is a revolution in communication and transportation. We'll get to the communication later on. You have the development of new technology which allows for faster travel, and a couple of different technological innovations. One is the canal. Okay, you may not think canals are that exciting, but between 1816 and 1840, Americans build about 3,000 miles of canals. You know, water is the fastest way of transportation unless you develop some kind of an engine. So you have actually states are building canals, or private enterprises building canals, usually with subsidies from a state in the form of bonds or other things. And the canals, and usually, okay, a bunch of us get together, decide to dig a canal, we're going to charge people to use it, so we're making money on this. You rarely find people engaging in these acts of, transportation or infrastructure improvement simply for the benefit of society or the good of humanity. I think one reason for the bankruptcy of many states now is that we did embark on a lot of public works projects for the benefit of humanity, and humanity has a way of kicking you in the teeth when you build the Zachem Bridge and the Big Dig and so on. Okay, so you have these canals. They cost about $125 million to build. And I should tell you, too, that in the aftermath of this boom of canal building, a lot of states go into bankruptcy. Probably the most spectacular, most notable of these canals is the Erie Canal that, cost about $7 million, and it was built between 1817 and 1825. That's about 8 years, which of course might seem like a long time, but you may recall that that's less time than it took to depress the central artery in Boston. Okay, so this opens on November 4th of 1825. Actually, in the fall of 1825. October 26th, the boat leaves Buffalo. November 4th, it gets to New York, cuts the travel time by a third. More importantly, it cuts the cost of shipping something from Buffalo to New York by 9/10. You may think, well, what's there in Buffalo that you would want to ship to New York? Well, it's not necessarily Buffalo. Buffalo becomes actually one of the centers for flour production, because Buffalo then becomes the eastern terminus for all of the trade from the Great Lakes. And all of that trade is going to go through by way of the Erie Canal into New York. And this is what makes New York the big booming metropolis that it becomes, is the Erie Canal. And it makes New York the chief Atlantic port of the United States. And this is where I have to stop and move on to another subject, because I get all choked up at the expansion of New York and the demise of New England, which is happening as we speak here in the 18 teens and 20s. Those guys at the Hartford Convention saw all of this coming. Okay, here's another idea, is a national road. You build a road to connect the Chesapeake with the Ohio. There's also a canal that's connecting the Chesapeake with the Ohio. Canals are expensive. Roads are cheaper to build, less efficient over the long run until you develop some kind of an engine. So by 1818, you have this road from Cumberland, Maryland, over the mountains to Wheeling, Virginia, and then you are on the Ohio River. By 1833, the road extends into Columbus, Ohio. Okay, so you have a road being built. This is going to become an issue later on. We'll talk about this, I think, next week, about Jackson and internal improvements, because he likes internal improvements, but he thinks the federal government shouldn't pay for them. Okay, now it's still quite slow. I said water is the more efficient way of traveling. unless, of course, you're going upstream or against the wind. And happily for us, we have yet another new invention. Incidentally, just in case you're wondering, it would take 2 days to get from Boston to New York in this period. That's the mail would travel. I have a friend who's a very learned historian, who's written a great book about the mail system, the development of the mail system, for those of you who are interested. It's called Spreading the News, which I'm sure is a title you can remember. His name is Richard John, and he's all about how the postal system developed. I recommend it. I see Ignacio's eyes glazing over, though, as I talk about the post office. So we'll move on to this other innovation that changes the way people can get stuff around, and that's the steam engine. Now, back in 1787, when our guys were watching or trying to trying to create the Constitution in Philadelphia, they took time out one day to go to the Delaware River and watch an experiment. This guy named John Fitch had developed a steam engine that could propel a boat upstream. This was an amazing thing, to have a machine that could go of itself. Such a great image. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention watching this, that another historian, Michael Kamen, wrote a book about the Constitution called A Machine That Would Go of Itself, which is also a very good book. Okay, so they watched this steamboat moving up the river. This is in 1787, but it takes a long time for this technology to develop. Partly because there is a big fight over who really owns it. You know, Fitch was the inventor, or he said he was the inventor. Someone else claimed he invented it. They have this big fight going on. In fact, one reason there is this demonstration is because the guy propelling the boat wants everyone to see he really invented this, and not this other clown who claims he invented it. There's this big quarrel over it. Fitch, the inventor, managed to get a monopoly for his invention from a number of the state legislatures. You know, he went and said, boy, if I can develop this technology, can I have a monopoly on all steam navigation in this state? And they all said, sure, because there's no chance he's ever going to develop this. Seems like a harmless thing to give him. He lost out. He actually winds up losing his monopolies because he can't pay to sustain them. Big quarrel over the invention. And a really smart guy named Robert Livingston buys up his monopolies as well as the patent. And Livingston, as you probably know, goes off to France in 1801 to buy Louisiana. And while he's in France, he meets another smart guy named Robert Fulton. And the rest is actually history. You don't know this story? I mean, I hate to ramble on things you already know, you're tired of hearing about. Fulton was in France because his real interest actually wasn't building steam engines to make ships go. His real interest was figuring out ways to blow ships up. And he was in France because Napoleon's about to go to war with the British. The British have a huge navy, and Napoleon realizes I can either try to build a bigger navy than the British, or I can figure out a way to blow up the British Navy. And here Fulton is, he is developing something that he calls the torpedo, we would call a mine. You put this stationary explosive thing in a harbor and wait for a ship to come hit it, and when it does, it'll blow up. Fairly simple principle. And Livingston actually hires Fulton, brings him to New York, where Livingston and his brother-in-law, a guy named John Stevens, are really interested in steam navigation and steam propulsion. In fact, Stevens, who lives across the Hudson River in what is today Hoboken, New Jersey, on his estate has a little steam railroad set up because he's really interested in this. And Fulton goes to work, and as you probably know, in 1807, another partner is a guy named Nicholas Roosevelt. He goes to New York and does develop a workable steamboat in 1807, which goes up to Albany, and this is a great thing. Livingston minds the main chance, which is a phrase from a play of this era, and the New York legislature gives him a monopoly on all steam navigation in New York waters. Okay? This is in 1803. Again, the legislature thinks, what likelihood is it anyone's going to develop a workable steamboat. Because if you think about the principle here, what makes a steamboat go? Anyone know? Steam. Okay, good. Yeah, okay, that's what makes it go. Yes. Excuse me? Yeah, pressure, multiple pistons. He's got a good scientific mind, I can tell. He's way ahead of the rest of us. I mean, we were back with steam, and yeah, you have pistons. Yes, you have a... Well, coal, you need something to make the steam. This is the first thing. Something to heat it up, okay? And you're immediately going to see why this is such a difficult thing to do. Because you're talking about a boat, and then in the middle of the boat, you're going to build a big fire. If any of you have ever been on a boat, you know you see a fire, that's a bad thing. Okay, and then, okay, if you can figure out a way to keep the fire from simply destroying the boat, what you do is you have to get some kind of a boiler where the water can heat up. And then there has to be a fairly narrow place. It's like a tea kettle. The tea kettle makes this whistling noise because the steam is trying to get out. You leave the cover off, it's not going to make a whistling noise because it doesn't have to go through this narrow opening. You can try this when you get home if you have a tea kettle. Tea kettle and a pinwheel. Or you can do some other kind of contraption to make this do something useful if you would like. So the steam all tries to get out of the narrowest opening, and then you can use that pressure, as our mechanical genius here said, to make pistons move, and that's going to make this go. Or some kind of a wheel you can have going because this water is pushing it, or the steam is pushing it. Now, there are a lot of problems with this, other than the fact you have this big fire underneath. Big problem, potential problem is this. The steam doesn't know, okay, when we heat up, we go through that narrow opening. It's just trying to get out. It's expanding. Okay? So if this has any kind of a leak in it, a rivet is loose or a joint is loose, it is simply going to push through that. The whole thing will explode, and you'll have shrapnel flying all over the place, and that will kill everyone on board, plus destroy the vessel, sink it in a big fiery explosion. So that's one of the problems with developing.
Steam engines to blow up British ships.
Well, they could have just used steam engines to blow up British ships, which actually in 1898, the United States and Spain go to war because one of our steam vessels in Havana blows up. No one is sure why it blew up. It could have just been a faulty boiler because once steam engines are developed, once Fulton gets his ship up the Claremont, up the Hudson River, we build lots of steamboats and lots of them blow up in fiery crashes. It's one of the hazards of navigation. You have these steam engines that can get you upriver, but also can kill you. And so, it's a trade-off, as most things are. Mike, you have a thought on that?
I've heard a quote attributed to Napoleon. You would make a ship sail against the winds and currents by lighting a bonfire under her deck. I have no time for this.
Yeah, that's a good quote. Okay. Yeah, could be one reason why he wasn't unhappy to see Fulton go. Actually, I should tell you, people were of two minds about Robert Fulton himself. There's one school of thought that he is a mechanical genius. There's another school of thought that he's a raving lunatic. And in 1811, he wrote a book called Torpedo Warfare. The future of warfare is in blowing ships up. And the Navy thought this was a stupid idea because they knew Fulton was a crank. Thomas Jefferson thought this was a brilliant idea. He forces the Navy actually to give Fulton's experiment a trial, and it's a disaster. It doesn't work, and that sets back our Navy actually considerable time because they don't get into what actually does win wars is actually blowing up other ships. Fulton, I didn't mean to tell you all of this. During the War of 1812, Fulton actually does develop an underwater cannon as a way of getting through the ship's defenses. And this becomes really a prototype for firing a torpedo. This is why these things become called torpedoes. Even though in the 19th century you see someone referring to a torpedo, they're referring to what we would call a mine, which is why in that memorable moment in September of 1864. Admiral Farragut said, as he's going into Mobile Bay, and he's advised, well, what about the torpedoes? And what does he say? Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead. No. Okay. So last time we got don't give up the ship, this time we get Farragut. Okay. Anyway. In 1808, once Fulton has successfully gotten this steamboat, the Claremont, up the Hudson River, and begins establishing steam transit between New York and Albany, Livingston renews his monopoly that New York had given him on all transit on the Hudson River and around New York. Okay? And Livingston, also you'll recall, he was over in France buying Louisiana. He now has interests in Louisiana, and the Louisiana legislature gives him a monopoly on transit in Louisiana waters, which is pretty significant considering the Mississippi River goes through Louisiana, or along Louisiana. So this really means something now, getting this monopoly. So he has a monopoly in New York, he has a monopoly in Louisiana, and then what happens, the steam engine itself, it's a fairly simple principle, very difficult to make a workable model. But once someone has developed a workable model, I mean, any of us now, based on what I have told you, could go home and build one of these things. Any of you could. In fact, instead of another paper, maybe that should be the assignment. Build a workable steam engine. Okay, we can talk about that as an option later on. So other folks start building their own steam engines. People in Connecticut and in New Jersey, particularly because they're the ones seeing this boat that actually goes upriver. Good thing. And what happens is New York says, hey, Livingston is the guy who has a monopoly on all steam navigation in New York. If you don't work for Livingston, you can't bring your boat into New York. Now, if you happen to have a steam engine in Connecticut or New Jersey, that's going to be a really bad thing. Unless you just built this as a hobby because you wanted to ride around in it. Most people are building this as an investment because they want to carry people and stuff around. So Connecticut says, hey, you know what? Our people who build steamboats can't go to New York. No one who has a New York license can come to Connecticut. How do you like that? New Jersey says, well, we're not going to give a monopoly to anyone in New Jersey to run a steamboat, but if someone from New Jersey who runs a steamboat into New York is then fined by the state of New York for violating their law, saying only the Livingstons can run steamboats here, New Jersey will award that person triple damages in New Jersey courts. You can see this is going to cause a lot of problems. Lawsuits between states or between citizens of different states because, they're all trying to develop steamboats, carry people from New Jersey to New York, which is one of the, and still is one of the main transit routes. And, New York courts say, okay, nobody is allowed to bring a steam engine into New York unless they're one of the Livingstons. The Livingstons bring suit, actually, and get a permanent injunction against anyone else other than a Livingston using a steam engine in New York. Meanwhile, there are other independent inventors in places like Massachusetts, Georgia, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, even Vermont, Lake Champlain, the Connecticut River, who are developing steamboats. You can see how Lake Champlain is going to be a problem since you want to carry people from Plattsburgh to Burlington and vice versa, and if you can't, you have to be a Livingston, that's going to be a problem. And some states are granting monopolies to their inventors to run steamboats, and others are refusing to grant monopolies, which means you have all kinds of stuff happening. So, getting back to our story here. John Livingston, who is the son of Robert Livingston, has a steamboat or a steamboat company that runs between New York and then it goes through New York Harbor, around here, to New Brunswick in New Jersey. Now, the reason you would go to New Brunswick, I don't know, has anyone been to New Brunswick? Okay. You can then get, it's easy, fairly easy to get from New Brunswick to Philadelphia. Okay? Much easier. Typically before, if you wanted to go from New York to Philadelphia, you would have to maybe sail this way and then get in a stagecoach. And sailing can be a problematic thing, depends on wind and tide and other things. Or you might go around by way of Cape May and the Delaware River. This way you can simply go to New Brunswick on a steamboat. Takes much less time. The steamboats can run pretty much frequently, nonstop, and unless they blow up, and that's a risk you take. Okay, a sailing vessel can sink. So John Livingston has this steamboat that runs between New York, by which we mean Lower Manhattan, and New Brunswick. Now, Aaron Ogden is a former governor of New Jersey, and he actually buys a license from Livingston to run a steamboat between New York and Elizabeth, New Jersey. And from Elizabeth, quite easy to get to Newark, which is a fairly big city, big town at that time. And so this is actually improving transportation in the area. So you have these two choices going from New York to Elizabeth or Elizabeth to New York, New Brunswick to New York. The steam engine makes it possible. Then in 1817, Mr. Ogden, former Governor Ogden, enters into a partnership with a guy named Thomas Gibbons. And Gibbons has a boat, actually has a steamboat, a ferry, that runs between Elizabeth and New Brunswick. So what you see developing here now is competition. You have this Livingston steamboat, direct shot from New York to New Brunswick. You have the Ogden-Gibbons line that goes to New Brunswick by way of Elizabeth. And what's going to happen when these two guys are in competition is that they're trying to go. A couple of different things could happen. And since you guys were so good at talking about the steamboat, I'll tell you what are the things that can happen when there is competition like this. One is each one will try to do this for less than the other guy and make the other guy lower his prices and possibly drive him out of business. Although the prices will establish an equilibrium according to the economists. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do, if you're the Livingstons, is sue these other guys to put them out of business, okay? You'll go to court because you, after all, have a monopoly on transportation in New York waters. These guys do not. And so Livingston sues the Ogden-Gibbons Consortium, and they sue actually in New York. And the courts in New York say, well, yes, because Ogden has this license from Livingston, he actually can run his steamboat here. But Gibbons has no business running a steamboat between Elizabeth and New Brunswick, because that violates New York's monopoly, which we've given to the Livingstons. Right? They don't want to hang this guy. What?
Elizabeth and New Brunswick both in New Jersey?
They are, but this is actually interfering with New York's monopoly on steam transit in Greater New York. And if you're a New Yorker, Greater New York includes just about all the rest of the world, I think. Yes, Greg.
It seems like they use the right to do that, although it's kind of...
Okay. Well, you would say they don't have a right to do that, but yeah, if they persist, they're going to get heavy fines from New York. Their boats are going to be seized by New York officials or by, New York's sea fencibles. That's like the maritime militia. And I'll tell you, Gibbons says, actually, I can run a steamboat wherever I please because I have a coasting license issued by the government of the United States, which gives me permission to travel, to run a boat between one port and another, back in 1793. Well, I'll tell you what happens. The New York court says, Gibbons can't run his boat anymore. Ogden sees which way the wind is blowing here. He immediately drops Gibbons as his partner. Says, you're out of luck. and he goes into business. Ogden goes into business with another guy, better financing, I suppose, than Mr. Gibbons did, named Cornelius Vanderbilt, henceforward known as the Commodore Vanderbilt. He's makes a fortune in this. And another guy named Daniel D. Tompkins, who is the Vice President of the United States and happens to live on Staten Island. And I believe the enterprise they start is now called the Staten Island Ferry. But this is how it all begins, okay? So you have here Ogden drops Gibbons as his partner because the Livingstons sued them both, and Ogden doesn't want to alienate the Livingstons, and Gibbons is left, Ogden goes into business with Vanderbilt Tompkins. Gibbons is kind of left hanging, although he has this coasting license, but he does the predictable thing. What is the predictable thing? He sues. Yeah, he sues Ogden. And he says his coasting license issued by the government of the United States has primacy over any state monopoly. And he actually sues in New York, and the New York court says, no, that's wrong. That's not true at all. The coasting license is just a license to sail from one place to another. It's not a license to trade anything. And it also says New York's legislature would not have passed laws giving a monopoly on navigation to anyone if there was this act of Congress that said they can't, that said, well, we give out the licenses to navigate. Why would New York have done something that violates an act of Congress? It's impossible, the New York court says. So Gibbons appeals when the New York court rejects the suit, first to the New York Court of Errors, great name, they hear things that were in error, and then the Superior Court, New York Supreme Court. If you watch Law and Order, you're familiar with these judicial entities. In 1820, the New York state courts dismissed Gibbons' suit, saying, what a bunch of nonsense. Of course, New York gets to say who sails and navigates New York waters. A coasting license isn't a license to trade. But Gibbons keeps suing or pursues the case, and in 1820, the Supreme Court actually decides to hear it, then dismisses it. Then in 1822, they decide to hear it again. And then finally, in February of 1824, the court considers the case of Gibbons versus Ogden. Okay. Ogden's lawyers are a couple of the eminent barristers of the day, Thomas Oakley and Thomas Emmett. Gibbons' lawyers are William Wirt, future Attorney General, or former Attorney General, I should say, and Daniel Webster. And the arguments actually go on for about 4.5 days. Today you argue a case before the Supreme Court, each side has half an hour. In these days, they would go on for as long as they needed to. And Daniel Webster's argument, it's probably not going to bring a tear to your eye the way the Dartmouth College argument did, but it's worth considering. It is, he says, a momentous decision which the court is called on to make. Here are 3 states, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, almost on the eve of war. It is the high province of this court to interpose its benign and mediatorial influence. If you do not interpose your friendly hand and extirpate the seeds of anarchy which New York has sown, you will have civil war. Your Republican institutions will perish in the conflict. Your Constitution will fall. The last hope of nations will be gone. Amazing. If Thomas Gibbons can't run his steamboat from New Brunswick to Elizabeth, it's quite cataclysmic. Now, the issue here isn't simply poor Gibbons wants to run a steamboat. The issue is, what are the powers of the states and the Congress? Concurrent powers, concurrent sovereignty. What gives Congress the power to regulate what goes on in New York Harbor, which is within the bounds of New York, or Newark Bay, or along the Raritan River? What gives Congress this particular power? And Webster says it comes from Article 1, Section 8. I'm sure one of you is going to jump up and say this, which says Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And Congress also has jurisdiction over navigable streams, okay? So, regulating commerce means that the Congress can regulate what happens here in New York Harbor. Webster says Congress has the exclusive power to do this. The Constitution actually says states cannot impose regulations on commerce, tariffs, and other things. So Congress meant for, or the Constitution meant for, Congress to have this power. And happily for Webster, he has a pretty good source for this. One of the arguments in the New York Convention in 1788, someone had said that Congress should have complete power over interstate commerce, to regulate commerce. Otherwise, you are going to have anarchy and a civil war. The guy who said this was Robert Livingston, who wanted Congress to be able to regulate all of this stuff back in 1788. I should tell you, if you ever are in an argument like this, it's really good if you can find a person on the other side advancing your own cause. So, Congress has the exclusive power to regulate commerce. Okay, that's Webster's argument. The other side says, well, why hasn't Congress done anything? New York had to act because Congress wasn't acting on this. Congress wasn't saying, okay, this is how the navigation is going to go. And if Congress doesn't act, Mr. Ogden's lawyers say, the states have to step in and act. The states are free to do so. So this is one issue. And they also say, this really isn't commerce. You know, piloting a boat around, even if you're charging people to get on and off, isn't really commerce. Commerce means buying and selling. And doesn't mean something else. Doesn't mean simply going from one place to another. You know, did I engage in commerce when I traveled here to teach class tonight? I don't know, that's an interesting thing we could discuss. Are all of you folks engaged in commerce? Is Diane engaged in commerce when she brings the camera in? This is the kind of question that comes up here. Okay, so what do you think? Who's right here? Ogden or Gibbons? Who should be able to decide who sails steamboats around New York Harbor? You say it's up to the Congress, okay.
If the Congress didn't act, then New York would appeal the Congress to act.
Okay. New York should have said, please, Congress, do something, because otherwise someone from New York is going to get rich piloting a steamboat between New York and New Jersey, and we wouldn't want that to happen. I can see, okay. That's actually quite close to what the court will say in this case. You probably now are familiar enough with how the court is going to resolve things, know that the court is going to say this is up to Congress. It's actually it's a very important decision here. Chief Justice Marshall begins the decision of the court by saying, first he has to answer this question, what is commerce? As New York had said, commerce isn't getting people on a boat and letting them off. And Marshall says, actually it is. We have to define the word, he says, in its natural sense and with a view to the objects for which the power was given. So why did the Constitution give this power to Congress? Why did the framers give the power over interstate commerce to Congress? And here, Marshall quotes what Webster had quoted, Robert Livingston's argument from 1788, that Congress should have the power to regulate commerce. And Livingston seems to take commerce in a very broad sense, and Marshall says we now can't limit that view or restrict that view. Commerce undoubtedly is traffic, Marshall says. It is buying and selling, but it is something more. It is intercourse. And all America understands commerce to mean navigation. Incidentally, if you teach high school or middle school, you have to be careful how you teach this particular case because that great line that commerce is intercourse. And in fact, people at the time drew attention to it. So all America understands commerce to mean navigation. And then the next question, what limits are there to Congress's power over this? Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. So that means commerce intermingled with, not commerce within a particular state. Congress can't regulate trade within a state, but between states or among states. A state could have quarantine provisions, health and inspection laws. You're bringing something into a state, they can inspect it, and laws to regulate internal commerce, but Congress alone has full power over interstate commerce. And even if Congress does not act on this power, the states cannot act. So, if a state grants a monopoly, such as the one the state of New York had given to Livingston and to Ogden, this monopoly is void because it infringes on Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. So New York can't grant a monopoly to anyone to navigate between New York and New Jersey, or for any stretch of this. So if Ignacio is getting on the boat in New Brunswick and is going to Elizabeth and then going on to New York, he is engaged actually in a stream of commerce. We don't say, okay, this part is just under the jurisdiction of New Jersey. Actually, there's a dispute over who owns this water between Staten Island and the New Jersey shore, because he's engaged in motion between states. That's actually a doctrine that will come along a bit later on. But Marshall wrote in 1824, powerful and ingenious minds, taking as postulated that the powers expressly granted to the government of the Union are to be contracted by construction into the narrowest possible compass, while the original powers of the states are retained, if any possible construction will retain them, may, by a course of well-digested but refined and metaphysical reasoning, explain away the constitution of our country and leave it a magnificent structure to look at, but totally unfit for use. So Marshall sees one thing that is happening here as an attempt by the states to enlarge their powers and to constrict the powers of Congress, while what the court is doing here is actually expanding the power, well, maybe not expanding, maybe just letting the federal government exercise the power the framers had intended for it. And what the decision does is ends steamboat monopolies, allows anyone who has the wherewithal to develop a steamboat, and it frees transportation so that various entrepreneurs can enter the scene and open up the country for commercial expansion. Now, this will be a good time for us to take a break, and when we come back, we'll find out other things that happened in the 1820s.